All right, everyone, I would like to welcome Emma Tacke. She is the Associate Director of Community Engagement for the Catholic Mobilizing Network. And as some of you might know, the Catholic Mobilizing Network does a lot of work around death penalty abolition, but they also do a great deal of work around conflict resolution and restorative justice in general. So we're excited to have her speak to us a bit more about how we can repair harm and conflict within our own ministries and within our own parishes. So thank you, Emma, for being with us today. We will be screen sharing some slides that you all can look at as she goes through her presentation, and then we will explain to you a little bit about how we will do the Q&A when it comes time for that portion. But please feel free to start thinking about any questions you might have for her as she is going along. So with that being said, I will give the floor to you, Emma. Thank you.
Great. Well, hi, good afternoon, everyone. I'm delighted to be here with you all for today's session of the Foster the Good Speaker series. As Rachel said, my name is Emma Tacke, and I'm the Associate Director of Community Engagement for Catholic Mobilizing Network. Thank you, Rachel, so much for this invitation. And please, everyone, feel free to introduce yourself in the chat, and I really look forward to hearing from you during our discussion portion of today's hour together today. And if you're able to, no pressure, but if you're able to share, show your video so we can see your lovely faces during this presentation, that is also welcome. But if you're not able to, that is also totally fine. And thank you, Rachel, for sharing my slides for me. Almost a year into doing exclusively presentations online, asking me to consult my notes while screen sharing is like still a monumental task that I have not mastered yet. So thank you, Rachel, for your help. And I will give you the cues when it's time to move the slides. So we can move on now to the next slide, Rachel. Thank you so much. So if you are not familiar with Catholic Mobilizing Network, like Rachel said, we are the national Catholic organization that works to end the death penalty and promote restorative justice through education, advocacy, and prayer. And before I go any further, I want to say that congratulations are in order to you all in the state of Virginia for the vote to abolish the death penalty that was passed earlier this month by the state legislature. Virginia, as you probably know, is the first Southern state to end the death penalty and is the state that holds the record for most executions carried out within the United States. So this is a really historic moment, not only for Virginia, but for our country as a whole, as we move away from the use of the death penalty. So I'm just truly delighted to be here with you all after this kind of monumental, historic time for the state of Virginia. So thank you. At Catholic Mobilizing Network, as we work to eliminate the death penalty, which we recognize as the most punitive, violent, and dehumanizing practice in our legal system, we also work to uplift responses to harm that are consistent with the gospel, centered on healing people, repairing relationships, and uplifting human dignity of all those impacted, including victims, offenders, and communities. From CMN's inception, restorative justice has been key to the identity of the organization, not a secondary endeavor, but rather a fully integrated core component of our mission. We know that each person is created in the image and likeness of God. All human life is sacred. That is fundamental to our faith. It is often said that hurt people hurt people. But there is joy in knowing that the converse is equally true. Transformed people can and will help transform brokenness. At CMN, we mainly focus on the use of restorative justice through the lens of criminal justice as we work to end the death penalty. However, we know that the philosophy and practices of restorative justice have a place in every part of society, including in addressing harm and conflict in ministry and faith-based settings. So what I'd like to share with you all today is how restorative justice fits into our Catholic faith, and I hope we can further discuss together how restorative justice can be a model for us as we live out our faith through our various ministries and within our communities. We know there is so much brokenness in our world, and we are not exempt from experiencing harm and causing harm in our lives. We do this within our relationships with our family, with our colleagues, volunteers, and community members. What I can offer today is how restorative justice can serve as an on-ramp in addressing harm that is much more in alignment with our Catholic faith. So we can go on to our next slide, please. So before we go further, I'd like to do a little check-in, and you can put your answer into the chat, please. So on a scale of 1 to 5, how familiar would you say you are with restorative justice? And 1 is like, this is my first time hearing about it. I have no idea what restorative justice is. And number 5 is, I know a lot about restorative justice. Maybe I should be giving the presentation instead of you. So go ahead and put your answer into the chat there. Great, thank you. I'm seeing some 4s, some 2s, some 3s. 1, good, 2 to 3, somewhere in between there. Good, great, thank you. Thank you so much for that. That's helpful to know. You know, we're all coming in different places of our understanding and learning of restorative justice. So no matter where we place ourselves in terms of the knowledge we have, we know that the experience of being hurt or harmed, and we've all been responsible for causing harm to one another at one point or another. So we all have experiences of harming and receiving harm as well. So restorative justice is relevant for us all. We can move on to the next slide, please. So of course, there is no single way to define restorative justice, but at CMN, we tend to describe it in this way. Restorative justice is a principled approach to justice that emphasizes living in right relationship and resonates deeply with gospel values and Catholic social teaching. Where human dignity and relationships are violated by harm and injustice, restorative justice upholds human dignity, builds relationships, seeks healing, and enables transformation within individuals, communities, and social systems. Restorative justice practices can include those impacted by harm in voluntary processes aimed to address needs, build understanding, repair harm, and work toward healing together through dialogue. A restorative justice approach undergirds opposition to the death penalty, centers the needs of victim survivors, promotes racial equity, honors Indigenous peacemaking tradition, and actualizes forgiveness and reconciliation. RJ is first and foremost a philosophy. It focuses on repairing the people and relationships violated by harm and is deeply connected to the biblical concept of shalom, or living in right relationship with God and one another. In this work, I am constantly reminded that our church teaches that this human dignity is not only individual, but relational, and we are integrally connected with one another. When one of our brothers or sisters in Christ suffers, all suffer with us. So as we explore the Christian underpinnings of this approach, we also acknowledge that the global social movement and practice of restorative justice owes an immense debt toward numerous Native Americans and other Indigenous peacemaking and healing traditions. We humbly honor the many Indigenous teachers who have generously shared their knowledge for the benefit of all people. We recognize that knowledge has often been taken, along with land and other resources, without permission from Indigenous peoples throughout the United States and the world. As a Catholic organization, we also recognize the historic role of the Church as an agent of colonization. We are guided by our gospel values and Catholic social teaching to continue to learn, understand, reflect, and act with an aspiration toward right relationships with Indigenous peoples in this country and beyond. Can move on to the next slide, please, Rachel. Thank you. Another way we can think about restorative justice is in terms of the questions that it asks, compared to the ones that our traditional criminal legal system asks. Traditional justice asks, 3 things. What was the crime? Who is guilty? And what should their punishment be? In our legal system, crime is defined as a violation against the state, not against people. In contrast, restorative justice asks a different set of questions. What was the harm caused? Who was impacted and how? And now what needs to be done to make it right? For example, we know that there are countless acts of racism that are not classified as crime, but are still deeply harmful. Additionally, when an instance of harm takes place, these questions from restorative justice allow us to consider what broader societal or structural issues may have contributed to it, and it can help address underlying causes to the extent possible. Restorative justice puts those who have suffered harm at the center of its process. It also acknowledges that hurt people, and many times, if not always, those who cause harm to others were first harmed themselves, especially as young people. RJ processes aim to address the needs of those harmed so that the pain may be transformed rather than repeated. Our retributive systems of justice prioritize the role of the state in ensuring those responsible for harm, quote, get what they deserve. In contrast, a restorative approach to justice begins with the question, who has been harmed and what do they need? Justice should center the voices of those harmed by violence, crime, and injustice in exploring pathways toward renewed safety, recovery, and healing. When we center the needs and voices of survivors, what we begin to do is to interrupt cycles of violence and build more humanizing systems of justice for all. Next slide, please. So restorative practices are dialogical processes that can help us to guide or facilitate a restorative response to harm. When many of us hear about restorative justice, we might think of an encounter between those directly impacted by or involved in a crime, sometimes referred to as a victim-offender dialogue. And this is certainly one way a restorative response can take place. But this is not the only way, and many times may not be possible or appropriate. Another foundational practice we can turn to in ministry settings is circle process or peacemaking circles. Rooted in and informed by Indigenous traditions throughout the world, including within the US, this approach is not limited to particular instances of harm, but it can be instrumental in community building and mutual support, helping to prevent harm in the first place. And some of you here today may have experience in circle processes or peacemaking circles already. For those of you unfamiliar, we can paint a picture, we can help visualize. Participants are seated in a circle of chairs without a table or desks between them. There may be a centerpiece of objects that help the group to visually center themselves, and frequently a talking piece is passed to signal the speaker. Sometimes in Catholic settings, the talking piece looks like a rosary, a crucifix, a prayer card. The important part is that by speaking in order of the circle as we go around, each person has the opportunity to share deeply from their own experience and listen deeply to others without interruption or responding to others. I know often in conversations that I have with people all the time, so often I'm not listening really to what they're saying. I'm just thinking, well, what am I going to say next? So a peacemaking circle or a circle process can help us recenter ourselves as we really focus on the person that is speaking with intention. And this alone can be deeply healing. It can be used in specific instances of harm, but can also help facilitate community building, prayer and reflection time, and addressing conflict or challenging topics. For those of you who are involved in prison ministry, this type of restorative response may be of particular interest. A board member of Catholic Mobilizing Network, Joe Cotton, is the Director of Pastoral Care and Outreach for the Archdiocese of Seattle. So among other things, Mr. Cotton oversees the Archdiocesan Criminal Justice Ministry. And within this ministry, it engages in parish-based prisoner reentry and offers restorative justice peacemaking circles for juvenile felony cases in King County. And the Richmond Diocese may also be doing something like this as well. I'm not sure, but this may already be happening. Another example of how circle processes can be used in ministry is the Precious Blood Ministry and Reconciliation, which is a nonprofit based in Chicago that's living out the spirituality of the precious blood. And it uses restorative practices like victim offender dialogue and peacemaking circles to serve youth, families, and community members in Chicago who are impacted by violence in the criminal justice system. And we don't have time today, but we actually on our website have like a 5-minute video that kind of demonstrates how Precious Blood Ministry and Reconciliation operates that I'm happy to send as a follow-up to this discussion. PBMR also works directly with men and women who are currently incarcerated through restorative practices. A circle process or a peacemaking circle could also be well suited for a parish event, as it gives everyone a chance to share and creates a space where all voices are heard and listened to. Even rethinking, for example, how you conduct a Bible study session or a talk on Catholic social teaching, it can be reimagined through a circle process where the discussion is guided by people taking turns to share their observations and questions in a way that is intentional and meaningful. So this is just one way to bring the practice of restorative justice into your faith community. Similarly, we know that using a peacemaking circle to address discord and conflict between colleagues or volunteers or community members, really any group that has a shared mission together but is facing interpersonal challenges amongst one another, could be a helpful way to repair harm and honor the dignity of all involved parties. Additional restorative practices you may hear about include family group conferencing, as seen in New Zealand. I certainly know my own family could use some family group conferencing from time to time. Community conferencing, pioneered in Baltimore. And restorative practices can also happen informally, when we engage in courageous conversations with those in our lives about when we hurt one another, how we were impacted, and what can be done to make it right. On a larger scale, processes of truth-telling and reparations, like those seen in South Africa following their apartheid, and Canada on Indian residential boarding schools, take on the questions of how restorative justice can be used at a systemic level. Here in the United States, the Equal Justice Initiative, you may be familiar with the nonprofit that Brian Stevenson, the author of the book Just Mercy, is the executive director of. EJI has a community remembrance project, which memorializes where African Americans were lynched throughout history. That's another great example of using restorative justice through a systemic level lens. We can move on to the next slide, please. So sometimes it's really tempting to focus solely on the practices themselves, as they feel like a really tangible kind of activity way to enact restorative justice. But Kay Pranis, a well-known trainer in circle process, reminds us that they are called practices for a reason. What I named in the last slide, they create a structure and space to rehearse, in a sense, the ways that we aim to live in every relationship in our lives. It is really the undergirding principles of restorative justice that we aspire to embody. When addressing harm in our various ministry settings and amongst each other, the aim is to honor the principles of restorative justice so that we may be guided by them when we seek to repair harm. So at Catholic Mobilizing Network, this is how we articulate each principle. The first principle is to uphold dignity. We pursue justice that upholds the value of all life, no matter the harm someone has suffered or caused. Harm and injustice violate the dignity and sanctity of those impacted. As we remember our shared humanity, we reaffirm the possibility of a new shared future in which all can flourish. The second principle is building relationship. We pursue justice that cherishes our interconnectedness. Our faith calls us into right relation with God, creation, and one another. Acknowledging our place within an interconnected web of relationships means fostering our mutual responsibility and accountability to one another. In the spirit of subsidiarity, justice should strive for collaborative and inclusive processes, encouraging the meaningful participation of those impacted by injustice. The third principle is seeking healing. A restorative vision of justice seeks first to address the suffering of those experiencing harm and victimization. This is achieved by attending to their physical, emotional, material, social and spiritual needs to the greatest extent possible. Justice then also seeks to encourage those who offend toward acknowledgement, discernment, penance, atonement, and making amends. Justice should therefore also seek to address unhealed trauma and destructive cycles within people who cause harm, so that they can stand spiritually ready to engage in reparative action. And the fourth and final principle is enabling transformation. We pursue justice that promotes individual and collective healing and change. Crime and violence are fueled by brokenness within individuals, our communities, and our social systems. For our communities to experience safety and wholeness, we must be willing to name and address the injustices of social inequity, systemic racism, trauma, and poverty. To do this, we must center the voices and experiences of those marginalized by victimization, incarceration, trauma, and systemic oppression. Next slide, please. So Catholic Mobilizing Network's mission, of course, is to end the death penalty and promote restorative justice. And in Pope Francis's third encyclical, released earlier this fall, Fratelli Tutti, had a lot to say about both of these topics. Although Fratelli Tutti doesn't explicitly name the words restorative justice, Pope Francis provided a compelling background of the important elements of this relational approach to authentic justice. And there are several quotes from him that we could pull out here, but I did want to highlight one of them. Quote, "Truth, in fact, is an inseparable companion of justice and mercy. All three together are essential to building peace. Each, moreover, prevents the other from being altered. Truth should not lead to revenge, but rather to reconciliation and forgiveness." Next slide, please. We as Catholics, of course, aspire toward a path of forgiveness. We understand forgiveness not as an obligation, but rather as a creative act of possibility and grace. However, we also recognize that forgiveness can play a pivotal role in motivating a restorative justice process, contributing to a meaningful experience of that process, but that it should never be expected or required of a victim or a survivor or a community at large to give that forgiveness. True forgiveness cannot be forced. It is a spiritual journey and personal choice which cannot be rushed or coerced. Restorative practices do not require forgiveness, but rather create the possibility and space of accountability, understanding, repair, and healing, which can make forgiveness, reconciliation, and other acts of love and grace more obtainable. As Pope Francis teaches us in Fratelli Tutti, in our call toward forgiveness, we must never condone or minimize violence, but we should confront it. We must never renounce our rights or those of others, but seek to uphold them. Pope Francis says, quote, "Loving our oppressor does not mean allowing him to keep oppressing us. On the contrary, true love for an oppressor means seeking ways to make him cease his oppression." Forgiveness does not forbid us from seeking justice, but it actually demands it. Forgiveness, Pope Francis goes on to say, is precisely what enables us to pursue justice without falling into a spiral of revenge or the injustice of forgetting. So in the spirit of Fratelli Tutti, restorative justice helps us recognize the complexities of forgiveness in this process toward justice. Next slide, please. The continued existence of the death penalty is an affront to the sanctity of human life. However, we cannot just look at the death penalty in isolation. Restorative justice, it's a practice that represents the culmination of the practice of capital punishment represents the culmination of retributive values inherent in much of our current legal system. It's kind of the biggest example of how deeply harmful our current legal system is. The death penalty renders impossible any potential for healing and for redemption. So when we challenge the death penalty, we question the many assumptions and beliefs that underlie its use, and which pervade many aspects of the US criminal legal system. Restorative justice helps us to envision creative ways to address harm that promote hope, healing, and human dignity. In our advocacy to end the death penalty, we affirm and support efforts toward justice transformation, which seek healing rather than punishment, dignity over shame, relationship rather than disconnection. All human life is valued and none are expendable. Revenge is mentioned 12 times in Fratelli Tutti. Pope Francis warns against being obsessed with taking revenge and destroying the other. For CMN, we recognize revenge or vengeance as the underbelly of capital punishment. It is likely what allows individuals, even many faithful Catholics who profess to be pro-life, tolerate the practice of the death penalty. And at best, the indifference to revenge is what allows more than 25 states to have the death penalty in their state legislatures. Pope Francis is asking and seeking to expose the seeds of violence in our hearts and systems and structures that continue to perpetuate hurt, more harm, and violence. He says, quote, "We cannot come to terms and unite for the sake of revenge or treating others with the same violence with which they treated us, or plotting opportunities for retaliation under apparently legal auspices." End quote. Nothing is gained this way, and in the end, everything is lost. For those calling for the death penalty often claim that it is for the purpose of bringing closure and justice to victims. However, time and time again, we hear the story of murder victim family members who declare that taking another person's life in their name not only doesn't bring them any sense of healing, it actually causes further re-victimization and traumatization. As Vicky Schieber put it, pursuing the death penalty would not be the way we would want to honor our daughter's life, nor would that decision have helped us deal with the painful reminders of her unfulfilled hopes and dreams. Next slide, please. So embracing the sanctity of life and dignity of persons requires us all to envision and pursue equitable relationships at individual, social, and systemic levels. We strive to act in solidarity and companionship with Black, Indigenous, and other people of color in the struggle for safety, dignity, and justice. We advocate for an anti-racist and equitable vision within the Catholic Church and beyond. We call for an end to mass incarceration and state executions of people of color, racialized policing practices, and other expressions of white supremacy within our social and legal institutions. In the pastoral letter that was published a few years ago, Open Wide Our Hearts, an Enduring Call to Love, the bishops discussed the disproportionate impact of racism on rates of incarceration and named the need for formal acknowledgement of our nation's history and atonement for the damage done in order to move toward healing and reconciliation. Restorative practices offer concrete ways to build relationships across racial divides, interrupt cycles of violence, and take action that promotes the dignity of all, inclusion and equity. Restorative justice principles and practices can guide transformative reflection and engagement that addresses the deep harms of racial oppression. Slide, please. Earlier, I mentioned that restorative justice can be described in 3 questions. And sometimes, we can expand on those questions, but one of our colleagues I wanted to share here on this slide, Susan Sharp, demonstrates the way that these questions align with the principles of Catholic social tradition. So after hearing, kind of everything I've just reviewed, let's revisit, how Catholic social teaching fits into restorative justice. RJ prioritizes those who have been victimized, remembering that many times those who cause harm were first harmed or victimized themselves. Human dignity is both individual and relational. We all have material, physical, spiritual, emotional needs for human flourishing. Rights and responsibilities are interwoven. We are all responsible for and accountable to one another. Those directly and indirectly impacted have a role to play, including families and community members. And we have to consider structures and systems as well as the issue or conflict immediately at hand. Those closest to the problem are closest to the solution and ought to not only have a say, but be at the center of the process that concerns them. So, all that said, I do have, I have some resources I want to share with you all. So I'm wondering, Rachel, if we can flip to the resources and then we can go back to the discussion question and kind of go from there. So on our website, we have a plethora of digital and printable resources, including film and book recommendations about restorative justice. There's access to recordings from our October conference on restorative justice and easy, one-page, two-page handouts. We also have a faith formation guide that we published in 2019 called Harm, Healing, and Human Dignity, a Catholic Encounter with Restorative Justice. This is a 60-page booklet that offers an introduction to the topic for individuals or groups and includes prayer, reflection questions, and links to videos. We have our Restorative Justice in Ministry listserv, and I think this would be of particular interest to this group. This is an email-based Google group, and it's a place to share resources, articles, and stories of restorative justice practices as they relate to Catholic ministry settings. Also on our website, we have a page devoted to helping you find a circle trainer. We really do want to create opportunities for ministry leaders to experience circle process because it is such a foundational restorative justice practice. So this page can connect you to various circle trainers and restorative events that we have coming up. And then we also have our Hope Over Death blog, which features stories of restorative practices in ministry settings and personal accounts of transformation and liturgical reflections. Currently on the Hope Over Death blog, we have our Lenten reflection series, which each week we publish a new Lenten reflection based on the scripture reading of that week. And then we also have lots of action opportunities concerning opposing executions and ending the death penalty where you're located. Luckily, Virginia has spoken. The death penalty is no longer in Virginia, but there are also relevant opportunities to take action against executions. And we have currently on our website a petition targeted to President Biden, who is a Catholic, urging him to take strong action toward ending the federal death penalty that I invite you to sign on to. And then I've also, you see we have our website linked there, but I've also included the website for the Kansas Institute for Peace and Conflict Resolution. And this is an organization affiliated with Bethel College, which is in North Newton, Kansas. And it's dedicated to resolving human conflict, both on a local scale and globally, and promoting peace and social justice. And they have a ton of great resources as well that I invite you to take a peek at.